The Anxiety and Depression Association of America reports that over 2.2 million people in America suffer from the effects of OCD. The compulsive behaviors associated with OCD can be incredibly restrictive and debilitating to individuals. Although there are specialists who can help with these issues, typical programs consist of 15 individual sessions which last from 90 to 120 minutes. These programs can be expensive, and limited availability often results in long wait periods. Furthermore, although specialists can help with some of the underlying mental issues, they can't be there for their patients when they need it most, their everyday lives. When considering this problem, we asked ourselves the following question: is there a way we can utilize technology to improve the treatment system for OCD patients? To answer this, we started by examining the current process which OCD patients go through and how it might be improved by technology. One of the first areas we decided we could help with is the patient diagnosis process. Current OCD diagnoses rely heavily on self-report. This is problematic, however, since patients often misremember details or misrepresent the severity of their compulsive behaviors. Ideally, a clinician would be able to spend a lengthy period of time with a patient, perhaps a full week, recording both how and when they repeat their compulsive behaviors. But that would be not only extremely expensive for the patient, but also completely unrealistic. Clinicians have many different patients they deal with. It would be unreasonable for them to spend an entire week with only one patient. Furthermore, the presence of the clinician might cause them to act differently. We need an unobtrusive solution which could actively record and report the patient's OCD behaviors.
To do this, we turned to the research of Lee and Yoon, who had developed a wearable camera for medication behavior recognition, which was able to accurately recognize and label actions such as opening the pill bottle and swallowing the pill by combining a convolutional neural network, or CNN, with a deep learning algorithm called long short-term memory. Although this has been heavily simplified, this illustration gives the basic idea of what the two systems do. The CNN takes in various objects, such as a pill bottle and a human hand, and differentiates them from each other. The long short-term memory then transitions the items to a temporal sequence of events, and allows changes in the items to be further differentiated based on the time in which they occurred. It was a perfect fit for our goals. The camera was small and obtrusive, and the system algorithms would only need a few small alterations to recognize the repetitive behaviors of OCD. For example, if our OCD patient constantly felt the compulsion to check that their door was locked, we could alter our system from recognizing a pill bottle and recognizing that it was being opened, to recognizing a door and recognizing that a person was trying to check that it was locked. Over a set period of time, our device would monitor the patient's behavior and record any instances where the patient might have been performing the repetitive behavior and send a report of it directly to the patient's file with their clinician. For many people with OCD, one of the first major steps is to recognize how frequently they perform their repetitive behavior. This can often be difficult under normal circumstances, but with video evidence for each repetitive behavior, the clinician could present them with concrete evidence and use it alongside the other information to help diagnose the patient and come up with a strategy to help them.
In addition to helping with the diagnosis, we also believe we can help OCD patients overcome their compulsions in their everyday lives. When an OCD patient is trying to overcome their compulsive behavior, sometimes all they need is a small prompt or reminder. While it would still help if the reminder came while the patient performed their repetitive behavior, it would be far more beneficial if it could occur before this, at the moment when they feel the impulse itself. Of course, the best solution for this would involve monitoring the patient's thoughts, but since this technology doesn't exist and would be ethically questionable if it did, we are instead focusing on the physical triggers which patients might experience. For example, an OCD patient who struggles with contamination OCD might feel the compulsion to clean their table every time they come into contact with dirt. If an algorithm could be created which could recognize this as a trigger, it could be very useful in the treatment of this patient. But developing a predictive system is incredibly difficult. Most of the current research on predictive algorithms has to do with cyclist or pedestrian behaviors near roadways. Two of the more popular algorithms are the dynamic Baynesian network and the multitasking deep forest framework. Put simply, both algorithms create numerous decision trees with a number of possibilities for a number of scenarios, and then compare them to try and determine the most probable predicted behavior. Our solution would be a little simpler than this, because we'd be able to work retrospectively. For example, if the sight of dirt causes an OCD patient to feel the compulsion to clean their table, then the algorithm would record all the events which occurred over the previous 2 minutes. Each time the patient cleaned their table, the system would run through the same process and compare the results with the previous ones. Over time, the system would begin to pick up patterns and similarities between actions. For example, it might notice that 70% of the time, before they cleaned their table, the patient also watered the soil in their flower pots. This information could be passed on to the client's file with a specialist, and the specialist could review the most frequent patterns to see if there are any likely triggers for the OCD behavior. Once these triggers have been identified, the clinician and the OCD patient can determine how to best use them. For some patients, they might only need a simple reminder or reassurance to keep them from giving in to their compulsions. When the patient is about to engage in a compulsion, their anxiety levels are high and they feel as though they're in danger. The warning emitted from the device shows the patient that the anxiety that they feel is not connected to a real danger, but rather a perceived one, making it easier for the patient to choose not to engage in the compulsion.
For others, it might involve the usage of exposure therapy. This is another area our device can help. Exposure therapy involves the patient being exposed to the triggers which cause their compulsion. For example, if an individual feels the need to clean their table every time they come into contact with dirt, a specialist might suggest that they expose themselves to dirt on a regular basis to help normalize it. If a clinician recommended exposure therapy, our system could be programmed to recommend exposure therapy every time it recognized one of the triggers. For example, if the previous patient was watering their plants, the device could send a reminder to the patient reminding them that their table was clean and recommending they expose themselves to their fear, perhaps picking up some soil. Finally, our device can also be used to notice and track improvement. Over time, as the device continues to monitor the patient's behavior, it will recognize when the patient is able to overcome their triggers and resist repeating their compulsive behavior. The clinician will then be able to go over these progress reports with the patient when they check in with them. Since our device relies heavily on several algorithms, it's necessary to have an evaluation system to ensure our system is working as planned. Due to the size of our budget, we will use Supervised Learning to train our system. Through each stage, we will establish a pass-fail evaluation system to record how frequently our system correctly completes its task. Our goal is for our system to be able to predict repetitive actions with 70% accuracy after training it for the patient's specific compulsion. We will also be keeping all diagnoses in the hands of a trained specialist. Our device can recommend a diagnosis to a clinician, but the final decision will always be under their control. There are possible consequences anytime a camera device, especially a micro camera, is being given out to patients. To prevent the abuse of the system, the patient will never have access to the actual footage. Furthermore, the device itself will only record and submit footage when repetitive behaviors are occurring. All other information will be discarded before it even reaches the specialist. This concludes our presentation on our device. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you enjoy it.